Friends, grace, mercy, and peace to you from God our Father and our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. So, I'm not really much of an outdoorsy kind of guy. No. Not a real, let's go hiking, honey, that'd be fun. Or, let's spend our vacation camping. That's not so much fun. My day of roughing is no turn-down service. It's true, I would much rather spend time in a museum or a concert hall or a nice plush resort. But I can be persuaded that from time to time, it's great to get out in nature. So long as there's not too natural. But no, there is something wonderful about being out in nature, right? Hearing water running, hearing the birds tweet, all those things we too often ignore. The lush, verdant colors of the forest. And then when you're out at night, especially if you're out somewhere really far away from all the light pollution of the city, out in a big open field, and it's just the darkness is almost palpable, right? You just surround you, and then you look up, and there's all those stars. Now, that can convert me to be a nature lover, at least for an evening. I think, for me, the first time I ever really noticed the stars were, well, 5th grade. I mean, I knew they were there, but I never really looked at them. And we did a unit on constellations. And so in the winter sky, we lived out in the country, I had to go out in the back of our field and actually look up. And suddenly I noticed there were so many more that I hadn't paid attention to. Does it ever happen to you that the first time you really looked up, you realized there's so many of them? And if you look close, you see ones even farther that you hadn't noticed before. There's Cassiopeia, Orion, Betelgeuse, and all these stars, they even have different colors. Some are blue, some are a little red, some are green. All these stars. Something in our story today, too. In our first lesson, Abraham noticing all these stars. It doesn't say he was out camping, but he must have been somewhere out in kind of the wilderness, right? To see all these stars, and then, well, he's not going to have a campfire, but there is going to be a fire. We'll get to that later. Our story, our lesson begins, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. What things? If you're like me, you might have said, well, just what came before? And even though we've been reading through the Bible together, you may have forgotten, because that was back in September. So I checked back in Genesis chapter 12. We're in 15. 12. That's where Abraham first hits the scene. He's this man living in Ur, which is not at all in Palestine, Canaan. Way over the mountains in the desert. He lives there with his wife Sarai and his father Terah. And God shows up and says, Abram, you are going to have many, many, many descendants. And they will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And you will be a great nation. At this point, Sarah and Abram have no descendants, no children. But Abram, without asking a question, without checking anything, says, okay. He doesn't even say, okay, he doesn't. He gets up and goes, travels all this way to this foreign land in Canaan, and sets up a new house, a new life. But before they're there very long, we're in this chapter, there's famine in this new land that God sent him to. So he and Sarah have to go down to Egypt. But God watches out, he doesn't complain, he just goes, returns. The next chapter, he and his nephew Lot have done quite well for themselves. So much so that they have to split up the camps. Lot goes one way and Abram goes the other. But Lot gets into some trouble. This is his first run into Sodom and Gomorrah. It's going to get worse, but this is the beginning. He's been taken prisoner, and Abram finds out, and Abram goes with God's power and is able to release Lot, conquering all the peoples, and but he gives it all back. He says, I only take what I need. And Melchizedek, up on the mountain, the priest in Salem actually blesses Abram, gives him a holy benediction. That's all those after those things. That's what happens right here, right now. He's just been blessed by Melchizedek. And then a vision God has anticipated that after all this, Abram might be getting a little nervous. One, because they still have no children, and thus far it's been kind of a wild ride, this new homeland God's called them to. But do not be afraid, I will be your shield. Your reward will be great. But Abram says, well, God, I've got some questions. For the first time, he questions God. He doesn't say, I don't believe. He just says, I'd like you to fill me in on the details. He says, how is it that I will be a great nation, for I have no descendants, and a slave in my household, Eliezer, is going to inherit everything from me? And God says, no, that's not how it's going to be, Abram. I'm going to give you a descendant. And Abram says, well, okay. God takes him out and shows him and says, see all the stars. Those stars will be as your descendants. You'll have that many, more than you can count. Look at them. And he has faith that God counts it as righteousness. Abram had some questions about God's plan. Any of you ever have some questions about God's plan? Well, you're all much more faithful than I, because I know all the time. I regularly say, God, I don't know what you're up to. I'm willing to trust if you just let me in a little bit on the plan, right? I'm willing to be faithful, God. Just cue me in as to what's the game plan, what's the operating system here, what are we going to do next? It's funny how God really just let me in on the God's plan. Is that what you do? I like to be in control when God says the first part of trust is giving up control. Trusting God means you don't get to be in charge. It means you don't get to know what's happening next. It means that you trust that God has got it. But that's awfully hard. Because I like to know what the game plan is. I like to be in charge. I like to know that what's coming next. God says trust. Have faith. That's righteousness. Trusting. Knowing that God has the end game. So our story speeds up a little bit, and maybe it's the next day. We don't really know, but it must have been a whole day because now the stars are gone and it's evening. And God and Abram are going to cut a covenant. I'm going to make sure to double check my notes so I get all the animals right. There's a lot of them. God says to Abram, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. But Abram said, O Lord, how am I to know that I shall possess it? God says, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, turtle dove, and young pigeon. And Abram brought them and cut them in two, laying them each half over the other, save for the birds. Ew. Gross. This is not approved by the ASPCA. He does not be happy about this. They're cutting a covenant. There's other Near Eastern precedent for this. This slaughtering of animals, not for sacrifice, literally, their death is simply to seal the deal. Seal the covenant. Each of these animals laid out, and the two parties that are going to make the agreement agree over it. The reason why, the thought is, it's sort of agreeing that you and I are in an agreement now. We're in a bond, a covenant. And if either of us breaks the covenant, may what happened to these animals happen to us. That's the idea. May if either of us are unfaithful, if either of us pull out, there's no fines, there's no penalty fees for this. May we be cut open and split. That's a pretty big deal. You better be pretty certain that you can live up to your part of the bargain if you're going to cut a covenant. And God and Abram cut a covenant. But if you pay notice, Abram doesn't have to do much to keep his end. Just be faithful.